A warm welcome to each and every one of you. My name is Paul-André Durocher. I'm the Archbishop of Gatineau, and this is Advent Readings, a series of reflections on the daily readings as they are proposed in the Roman Catholic liturgy of the Eucharist during this Advent season. Today is December 17th, Thursday. We are starting the second part of Advent right today, which is a kind of an 8-day countdown to Christmas Day. Some people call it a reverse octave. Often in the liturgy, we celebrate 8 days of a feast. There's an 8-day echo, you can say. We have that at Christmas and we have that at Easter. But we also have at Easter a Holy Week that leads to Easter. And for Christmas, we have this 8-day countdown, you can call it. And the texts of the Mass reflect that. A few things reflect that, actually. First of all, we change the preface. The preface at Mass, there are two prefaces for Advent as to open the Eucharistic prayer. One that goes from the beginning of Advent till the 17th. On the 17th, we change. The first one is more general in nature. It speaks about the first coming of Jesus, of the Christ at Bethlehem, his coming as man, and then it opens up onto his second coming in glory. Whereas the second preface that we start using today until Christmas is more specific, you could say, naming, for example, the prophets, the hope of the prophets, and the expectation of Mary and John the Baptist revealing his presence in his days. So the second one, the first one is kind of tinged with hope, and the second one is tinged with joy, you could say. So the joy of Christmas is already in our hearts. The other thing that marks these last 8 days is what we call the great antiphons, or the antiphons, special antiphons that are said that invoke Jesus, the Messiah, with different titles. And these antiphons are used at evening prayer in monasteries and what we call the Liturgy of the Hours when we sing the Canticle of Mary. And it's also used as the acclamation for the Gospel at Mass. So, for example, today, December 17th, the O antiphon is O Wisdom of our God Most High. So the title that is given to Jesus is Wisdom. O wisdom of our God Most High, guiding creation with power and love, come to teach us the path of knowledge. So we have this preface that is special to these 8 days. We have these O antiphons, which will change every day, and we have the Gospels themselves. Up to now, we've been looking at texts that speak about how Jesus saw or related to John the Baptist. Now we're going to enter into the passages of Mark and Luke's Gospel, which deal with the events leading up to the actual birth of Jesus. So we're getting into the story of Jesus' birth. Let's start with this Gospel, Matthew 1 to 17. So this is the very beginning of Matthew. And it starts in a very unusual way. Let's start. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Aram. And it goes on like this at length for 14 such, not 14, 3 times 14, which is 42 generations like this. And it concludes this way. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. What a strange way to start a gospel. Well, strange in a way, because giving genealogies is typical of biblical times of these, how can you say, this culture. People would want to give their genealogy because they identify with their family and with their family history. It also gives them status, particularly if they can name famous people in their genealogy. So often biographies of famous people would include their genealogy. And actually, Matthew isn't the only one who does this. Luke also, though Luke doesn't start his gospel with the genealogy. Luke waits until Jesus has been baptized by John the Baptist, then gives Jesus' genealogy. And if you compare the two, you'll see that they're two very different lists. They're both through the Father, because it was through the Father that, how can you say, one's ascendancy was established, though both lists say that Jesus's real father was not Joseph, yet the genealogy is listed through Joseph. But they are very, very different, both of them. And you can tell because of that they are constructed genealogies, as genealogies were often constructed back then. There were no written records to go check who had been father of whom. There were no birth certificates anywhere to go check, So these lists are expressions of faith. We have to, I think, accept this and take them at face value and ask ourselves, what is the faith message here for us? It probably isn't a historical record, but that's not the point here. Matthew has a message for us. And what is his message? Well, first of all, he traces the genealogy of Jesus through the line of the kings of Israel. Luke doesn't do that. Matthew does. It's through the kings of Israel, starting with David, down through the list up until the deportation. And most scholars would agree that the reason is he really wants to show that Jesus is in the line of King David. He is a successor of David. And what is said in the prophets about a descendant of David ruling over Israel and his kingdom being an everlasting kingdom, that this applies to Jesus. Jesus really is descending through the kings of Israel. The other thing is that before getting to David, he goes back to Abraham. And the list he gives of Abraham are the patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Perez, and then Hezron and Aram and Aminadab. And when you read the history of these patriarchs, they're a mixture of faith and doubt, of how can you say, great courage and just ugliness sometimes. You really get the feeling that these are not wonderful, ideal people. We'll come to Judah in a moment, because in the first reading we'll read about Abraham's grandson Jacob and his son Judah. These are not great people. And through the list also, sometimes they name women, Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and then the father of Boaz by Rahab. And these women, generally, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, with whom he had committed adultery. Most of these women really are they're not the holy women of the Old Testament, by no means. They are women who are at the margin, either because they are prostitutes, or they are widows who've disguised themselves as prostitutes, or they are adulteresses. And so you get this really mixed bag of people in this genealogy. It's as if Matthew wants to drive home the point that, look, Jesus is born a true human being, descended from humans with all their faults and all their weaknesses. And in a sense, he's saying, and his mission then is entrusted to human beings with all their faults and all their weaknesses. Raymond Brown points out that the fact that the kings of Israel were such awful kings for the great majority of them, not faithful to the covenant, and yet it's through that line that God acted, is maybe a sign that the church itself is far from perfect. I mean, when you look at the history of the popes, you see some tragedies. And we know today how, some church leaders have truly been unfaithful to their own commitments, to their vows, to the teachings of the church. So, I mean, to basic civil law when we speak about things like pedophilia. And yet, the message of the gospel continues through them. So, the history of salvation moves forward through very weak, poor, frail, fragile, sinful human beings. That seems to be part of the message of this genealogy. And finally, the last part of the list that starts from the deportation of Babylon, when after the last king, the last two kings, Zerubbabel, and then Matthew has Zerubbabel is the father of Abiud, Abiud the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Asor, Asor the father. These people are not even named in the Old Testament. We have no idea who these people are. These are unknown people. And it's a way, I think, for Matthew to say that yes, Jesus is a descendant of great kings, but also of unknown, anonymous people who each have contributed somehow to the history of salvation. Because of these unknown people, Jesus has come into the world. And so it's a way also for Matthew to say, you are unknown. You are anonymous. There won't be great histories. You won't be named in great history books. And yet, the kingdom of God comes through you. The message of Jesus continues through you. And then we come to finally the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. And the fact that in this genealogy there are women whose kind of, how can you say, the story of their relationship with whoever the father is not a clear story. Well, here also the story isn't clear, and Matthew's going to address this right away. We'll see it tomorrow, because Mary's son is Jesus, but Jesus's dad isn't Joseph. So what does this mean? And he concludes by saying, and Jesus was born who is called the Messiah. So right away at the beginning of his gospel, well, he said it right at the top, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. And I think the final message is that basically what is happening in Jesus is this culmination of the whole history of Israel, starting with Abraham. That this is all of Israel moves towards this fulfillment in the story of Jesus. And this is how Matthew wants to start speaking about Jesus, already inviting us to enter into this story, that there's a story before Jesus and there's a story after Jesus, and the story after Jesus in which we are involved resembles the story before Jesus, with all its faults and all its warts, and yet God does wonders through this. God manages to change the world through unknown, sometimes fallible, always fallible, sometimes very sinful human beings. That's the first reading. That's the gospel reading that we read today. Let's go to the first reading. And the first reading is from the book of Genesis, chapter 49, verse 2, and then we skip to verses 8 to 10. And it speaks of one of these ancestors of Jesus. So as I said, Abraham's grandson Jacob. So Jacob is the one who had two names, Jacob and Israel. And Jacob had 12 sons, so that each claimed to be the ancestor of a tribe, or at least the tribes claimed these 12 sons as their ancestors. And David was born from the tribe of Judah. Now, the story of Genesis that is being told here of Jacob is practically 1,700 years before Jesus, and David didn't show up until 700 years after that, and the story itself wasn't written till about 1,000 years after that. So a lot of these stories are kind of reprojections, projecting back into the time of the patriarchs, the faith of the people at the time it was being written. whatever it may be, let's read this story about Jacob. So Jacob here is dying. It's at the end of his life, and deathbed speeches are always important speeches and stories. It's like the last will and testament. It's like Jesus the night before he died, gathering his apostles and saying, "Take and eat, this is my body, this is my blood." It is such an important moment because it is just before he dies. Here Jacob calls his sons, gathers them up, and says this, "Gather round, that I may tell you what will happen to you in days to come. Assemble and hear, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel, your father." And then he speaks to each of his 12 sons, and some of them he curses, some of them he blesses. In a sense, they're all blessings, but some of them, the blessings are less beautiful than others. But to Judah, now, Judah is not the firstborn. Judah is, I think, the thirdborn. I think Reuben is the eldest. But, Jacob wasn't the eldest. His brother was Esau, and Esau is the one who was yet Jacob is the one who's chosen to continue the line. And even Abraham had Ishmael as a first son, and Ishmael was not the one through whom the line continued. It's Isaac, the secondborn. So there's a kind of a story here of the secondborn all of a sudden acting as the first, the one who's rejected, being chosen to be the first. That also is part of the story of Israel and of Jesus's genealogy. So here again, here's a third generation where the eldest does not take up the mantle, but here it's Judah. "Judah, your brothers shall praise you," he says. In other words, your brothers will see you as their elder from now on. "Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Your father's sons, your brothers will bow down before you." But you have to understand this as being a prophecy for the generations to come, so that it means the other tribes will recognize Judah as being the senior tribe. "Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches down, he stretches out like a lion, like a lioness. Who dares rouse him?" It's kind of a prophecy of might in battle, of the ability to conquer one's enemies like a lion, very powerful. So then he adds this line, which is quite interesting. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah." Now, a scepter is a leader's staff, and it goes on, "nor the ruler's staff from between his feet." Between his feet is a euphemism, you can say, for his descendants, "until tribute comes to him, and the obedience of the peoples is his." So there's a real sense here that Judah and his descendants will be rulers, and the idea of a scepter is like a king's scepter. Now, there wouldn't be a king in Israel for, as I said, 700 years until David, and God will make this covenant with David and saying a descendant of yours will continue to rule. But we see how this text could be interpreted by a prophet like Ezekiel, who echoes the text and speaks about a descendant of David, and that, the judgment shall not depart until comes the one who is to bear that judgment. So there's a real sense here that for the people of Israel, that there's a prophecy of the Messiah in this expression, this blessing of Judah by his father Jacob. That Judah would be the ruler, that out of Judah would come a ruler, David and his descendants, and ultimately the Messiah. And Christians believe that that Messiah is Jesus. But his rule is not a rule like that of a lion over his enemies, unless you say his enemies are the powers of evil and of death. And yes, in his resurrection, Christ rises up like a lion over those enemies and over those powers of destruction. So these are the texts of today that are quite fascinating and quite rich. They invite us to enter into these last 8 days before Christmas, really reflecting on the meaning of Christmas and on the identity of the one whose birth we celebrate on that day. And with that thought, I leave you, and my blessing goes with you too, till tomorrow.